So I'm going to start with this. Natural disasters do not exist. And sadly, we still hear this term natural disasters being batted around very frequently. Actually, I called out the big insurer Munich Re last week on their use or their continued use of this term, because we know now from a variety of sciences that our perspective has shifted over the years, and disasters are not natural. And I would like to explain that a little bit further by taking you from a very small example to really the global scale. So if you want to go to the next slide, Claudine. Thank you. So this is my dog. This is my dog, Pebble. And neither my dog nor I like getting wet. So before I head out on a walk, what I do is I grab this handy little device that I have here, and I look at a Dutch app because I live in the Netherlands, and it's called Buienradar. It translates to rain shower radar. And it's a handy little app that'll show me whether there's any rain expected in the next 3 hours. Now, based on that information on this forecast, I will make a choice. I will choose to dress appropriately by maybe putting on my raincoat, or maybe I'll grab an umbrella. Because after all, the saying goes, there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. So I can fully prepare for these conditions that are going to come my way. Or I might even decide to postpone my walk and walk with her later. And what I am doing in this sort of scenario is that I'm actually, on an individual level, I am dealing with my environment. And I think you probably all do that if you live in a rainy place like I do. Before you go out, or even if you're somewhere on vacation, before you go out on a hike, you're going to make sure that you're prepared with different types of clothing, depending on what the weather is going to throw at you. And if we look at this really from an emergency management perspective, what we would call this is that I'm taking preventative actions before the quote unquote disaster of getting soaked occurs. Now, Claudine, if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. And if we zoom out from the individual level to a national level, in my case, looking at the Netherlands again, about dealing with your environment, when you arrive at Schiphol Airport nowadays, which is our main airport in the Netherlands, you can find some signs like this one. They tell you, welcome below sea level. I was not quite sure whether that was an appropriate way to welcome people to the country, but hey, we'll leave that for you to decide. But in this case, what's happening is that the generations that have come before me and my generation, we continue to do so. We choose through the way that we vote, etc., through our democracy, that protecting our country from the water, and a lot of our country is, a significant portion of it is below sea level. We like to protect that. And we've decided that this is what we're going to do. This is how we're dealing with our environment. We think it is okay as a society that we invest a lot of money in big engineering works, in pumps and in dikes and in the science to keep our feet dry. Now, I think this is great, that we spend our resources like that. But this is, again, it's managing a risk of something natural on a societal level. And what we're managing in this case specifically is both the sea and the rivers that flow into the Netherlands. However, if we zoom out to a global scale, you may go to the next slide, please, Claudine. Thank you. What we can see is that 2023 was sadly a huge disaster. There were 74,000 fatalities that have been recorded as the result of various disasters, although a lot of that number can be attributed to the huge earthquake that struck Syria and Turkey. All of the disasters, whether that was weather-related disasters in the US, they saw a lot of those, or these earthquakes that were occurring in other parts of the world, or droughts, etc., they tallied up to a cost of more than $250 billion US. And that is just a mind-boggling number. It's so huge. And globally, it was the hottest year on record, as I think we've all heard over and over again. And these numbers are staggering. And what I'd like to reiterate is that none of these numbers are natural. None of this is caused by natural disasters. They do not exist. It is all a consequence of choices that we as people have made about how we want to spend our lives, how we distribute resources within society. Now, thankfully, there is a discipline that is tasked with addressing the risks that natural hazards, because natural hazards do exist, that the risks these pose, and to reduce the losses that happen when we do encounter these natural hazards as societies. And that discipline is emergency management. So the emergency management seeks to promote safer and more resilient communities that have the capability to cope with anything that nature might throw their way. And we use the term emergency management a lot. It's a term that's very frequently used in the US, but also Australia and New Zealand. But you'll also see this type of work referred to as disaster risk reduction. Claudine, if you want to go to the next slide. I promise I'm only going to give you one equation, and that's this one. So the probability of losses, which is on the left here, that is what disaster risk is. So it is whether or not and how likely losses are going to occur. Now, these are a function, as I've been mentioning, the various components of the actual hazard that we're exposed to. Now, that can be a cyclone coming your way, that can be a tornado, that can be an earthquake, that can be a volcanic eruption, anything like that. Then it is a matter of exposure, whether or not we've put people in harm's way. So we know, for example, in the UK, there is still building going on in floodplains. Now, of course, if you put people in the way of flooding, they're going to get exposed to this hazard, and thus a disaster might occur. But again, it's not because of the flooding, but it's because we choose to put people in harm's way. Then there is vulnerability. That's the physical, social, economic, or environmental factors that might increase a society's susceptibility to a hazard. For example, less financial resources can make you more susceptible. Not necessarily, but it does happen. And then sort of the flip side of that, though capacity is not quite the inverse of vulnerability, is the capacity. So that's all the resources that are available to manage the risks or the impacts if something does occur. Or to get rid of this equation altogether, we can go to the next slide, get rid of it. Thank you. And Ban Ki-moon in 2011 actually said, by our actions, we either compound disasters or we diminish them. And in the end, it's that simple. So what we do, how we choose to do it, that means that disasters can occur, and it also dictates the severity of disasters or not. So if I go back to the example that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, where I think about getting wet, and I'm acting before something occurs and taking that preventative action. Now, what we know is, if we'll go to the next slide, thanks, Claudine, so that if we take action before something happens, that every dollar that you spend in reducing the risks posed by disasters can save $15 in post-disaster recovery costs. And that value that I'm quoting 15 here from the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Program, but I've seen it vary anywhere from 8 to 23. And so actually investing before something happens is a huge part of preventing disasters. And this is really important. And sorry, lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, and I think that it's what's been really difficult, and still is really difficult, is actually getting enthusiasm up for that. And getting people to make these sorts of investments, both on an individual level, when we look, for example, at individual disaster preparedness. A lot of people will not have thought about that on an individual level, all the way to international levels, where we can see sometimes that it's very difficult to get investment in large-scale preventative projects. Now, there is some change, thankfully. If you want to go to the next slide, Claudine, we're seeing some really nice initiative. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. Of course, I should have mentioned that the real value in emergency management is the saving of lives and livelihoods. Okay, next slide, thanks. We're seeing some really nice initiatives pop up to actually get more investment into that preventative space. And part of that is the Averted Disaster Award, which I think is really interesting. So I encourage you all to check it out. And that's really looking at projects that will have taken preventative action. And so no disaster has occurred, but generally that doesn't receive the recognition that it really should receive, because of course no disaster occurs, and therefore it doesn't become a media worthy or interesting thing to look at. So why do we need design? I think you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So if we bring design into this emergency management space, something really interesting happens. And when I'm talking about bringing design into the emergency management space, I'm really talking about design in all of its glory and all of its subdisciplines. We need everybody. But because emergency management traditionally is very much a top-down command and control kind of approach that's very quantitative, and it's very risk-centered, it tends to forget, or tended to forget, in some cases it still does, about the human aspect. And of course, I think, as you all know, design is bringing especially that to the table. It's bringing that human-centered aspect. It's bringing a more qualitative flair to the work that's being done in this space. And that is so important, to not just focus on these risks, but really focus on the people that are experiencing these impacts and bring their knowledge into this as well. Because I think that's what design also has to offer, is there's so much history going back to the 70s already looking at participatory design, that's a huge chunk of knowledge that I think that emergency managers, when I've spoken to them, have really struggled with. And so this is something where we're very complementary as a discipline in bringing this to emergency management. So I think, this is really nice. And the other place where I can see a really important part of design is that it can help people to not just address the challenges that we're seeing right now, but it can also help us envision or even experience the future and how we might want to shape that. But we can only do so, and I'll now quote from the book, if you'll excuse me, is if we practice design skillfully, reflectively, responsibly, and with a full awareness of what one is doing while designing. And that quote belongs to Greg Vigneault from, I think it's chapter 1 in the book, if you're interested to learn more about what he's written about. And with that, we started this very broad introduction to emergency management and where I think design for emergency management really comes into the fore. I would like to hand over to Claudine to show you some specific design examples.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, did you want to talk about this really quick?
No, I decided to skip over it in the interest of time.
Okay, amazing. Dream big.
But we could definitely talk about it later.
I thank you so much, Saskia. I mean, Saskia is, and I know Rodrigo's here as well. She is the coolest because she has that amazing title that she brings to the group. What I would like to kind of bring in here, and we're really cognizant of time because the discussion is the most important, most exciting part about this event, is just to tell you a little bit that, when gosh, was it 7 years ago, Saskia? 8 years ago, we were at a conference. And it was really 2 people. I was like, hey, I'm interested in this. And Saskia's like, me too. And from then, 7 years is not that long of a time, but Design for Emergency Management, now Design Network for Emergency Management, which is now Design for Emergency Management. There was a group of us. You see the picture here. This is the board of directors. We're very serious people. There's Saskia, Klaus Kremer from New Zealand, Tingy Lin from Taiwan, Rodrigo from Chile, and myself. And so we found each other and we started this group. And what's really interesting is it was a selfish interest that I had. A lot of people know I wanted to be a first responder. I wanted to be a forest firefighter, very hero complex issues when I was in high school. But this selfishness, this kind of like wanting to find a way to merge design into this kind of first response way really was shared. And it wasn't just shared among like 5 individuals. We're all from different countries. There's such a overlap in how emergency management is, the roles of emergency management and the role of design. And this book that we just came out with is even more amplifying of that, where we have 14 chapters from different approaches. So not just the traditional, what we call, I hate to say the D word, deliverable, right? We define deliverable super different, where we're taking angles of just not artifacts, but also thinking about philosophy, thinking about process, chapters on controversies and oversimplification or standardization. So this really diverse interdisciplinary approach to design in this space. I chose just three, because of time, and we can go back and forth, but I just want to show just the overview of the topics covered in this book. And it really is meant to be holistic as much as it could be. It's, it's, as we know, right, Saskia, the first of its kind, just really being this niche in design and design for emergency management, but really trying to cover these different aspects from different voices and representation and culture in different countries. These are the perspectives and case study represented in the chapters from these different countries and authors. And when I thought about this group and I thought about Triple ID specifically, I just highlighted 6 just to get us talking about it. But I wanted to stay in evidence-based design work that, that our practice as information designers is being able to use studies and being able to prove and show evidence that something in fact is not working or is working, and having those benchmark studies. So Rodrigo, and I know he's here, the Gamil icons is one of those projects. Josefina's looking at, which is so fascinating, looking at maps versus graphs. So in the UK, looking at depicting risk awareness in map formats or artifacts versus a graphical in river levels. And I've had something similar with fire mitigation, again, huge words, but using sort of these infographics rather than mapping. And what's interesting about Josefina's study was the accuracy in response as far as information was looking at the graphs, but participants were much more preferred the more simple maps. And this is the sense of orientation and place and familiarity. And that's the human component. So scientifically, the accuracy part is like, yes, that's what we want, the data portion, but really the connection that the public has with their information, the relationship they establish with what is risk, is starting to be talked about and understood. Chia Huanglin is doing something really exciting about dynamic signs. And actually, what's interesting about her study is being able to run a study with hazards. I couldn't do that in the United States because of the research board. I wanted to shake things up and spray them with water, kind of like the FAA does with airline safety, but they said no. So, but what's great is that this project actually introduces some cognitive stress and looking at dynamic signs, moving signs versus stagnant signs, which was very interesting. And I have some case studies on that. And the second part I just wanted to bring out for this discussion in this group is standards. There's a few looking at standardization. And so I was really interested in the tsunami work that I've done for years. Can those standards translate to fire? So multi-hazards, where if it's the same risk awareness, can we use the same approach in a visual standard? Since then, Elia was looking at the communication component and changing the culture shift and mindset of emergency managers who are not trained at all in visual communication or campaigning, or maybe it's very minimal, but looking at how these infrastructures get put into a system, then that's then distributed, right? So looking at those kinds of standards. And then Klaus and Saskia looking at, again, reinventing the wheel over and over again. These are boat things. These are boat flares, emergency boat flares, and so familiar in what has been done in medicine packaging, right, and medicine information, and this idea of standards. It changes all the time, and who's making those changes. So their chapter was dealing about that. So I chose projects that were evidence-based design projects, standardization, but hopefully the discussion could weave in and out. And I just end with this quote from Alice and Caroline's chapter. And what emergency managers, and I've been working in that space, it's very authoritarian, very illiterate when it comes to visual or alternative formats and communicating with the public, but that it's always about preparedness as far as their deliverables concerned. But I love this idea of just the awareness. And Saskia, you brought that up in the beginning. Are they even aware in the preparedness. Like there's something right before that to even get to the preparedness component to it. So it's a really mind and culture shift that we're working in as far as this space. And I think that concludes. We just have this little bit. If you want to QR code that or just screenshot if you want to contact afterwards. But looking forward so much to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Claudine and Saskia. I've absolutely found it fascinating to see what's happening. And congratulations on publishing a book about this, which must have been quite a challenge to get everything together and get it published. I've got several questions, but I really would love to ask other people to start. Who would kick us off with a question to Claudine and Saskia?
Any raised hands? No. There's one question that occurred to me. Do you have any ideas why it seems to be hard to convince authorities to engage in an emergency design process?
Saskia, can I just, it's a trigger for me, so and then I'll pass it on. One of my first experiences, so I've been in search and rescue through the sheriff department. So I've been sort of inside, I guess, the culture, right? But not as a designer, completely undercover, if you want to say. Like I was not a designer. I'm like, I'm here to learn and rescue people. And so I really understood how dominant and authoritarian the culture is. But fast forward, when I went to my first conference, it's the National Evacuation Conference here in the States. They are set in their processes, Veronica. And so when they even looked at my card, being from the art department, being a designer, I really was not welcomed. So I think there's this devaluing of design because of the stereotypes of design that they have embedded from whatever they've learned. It's not part of their curriculum. It's not part of their culture at all. And so it was really that first initial response where I'm like, oh, we have to educate on the value of design in the first place, why I do belong. And it wasn't until I was able to present data-driven, evidence-based, quantitative study that they were like, oh, so it was this really high climb about what is already established and locked in. I speak for the United States. I speak for what I know here, but Saskia, do you have any ideas?
I think the other thing that we're seeing now is that the reason that they're not that willing to engage is that, you know, we are all designers in a way. And hey, when they have an access to a Canva account and they can make their own little graphics, they don't necessarily understand what they're communicating with the various aspects that they're choosing, but they think they can do it. And that sort of, again, there's just lack of awareness of the value of design. And also, like Claudine said, it's just this sort of background that they have, because what you see in a lot of countries now is that they'll kind of start to engage in it. And there's a lot of this actually happening in New Zealand, that they're really starting to engage with social scientists. And they're like, okay, well, you're the social scientist lot, but we'll let you do some studies on how people perceive things to be. But they're sort of getting to the cusp of seeing that design can bring something valuable in addition to that, because of the knowledge that designers have in ways that you can really steer human behavior through various sort of small choices in the end. But they're just not quite there yet.
Thank you. Robert Linsky, you have a question.
Yeah, I was curious if you recall a big fire in Maui last year. I don't know how true this was, but the emergency manager claimed that the alarm alerting people was meant for tsunamis, and that with the fire, it was a different kind of response. And if they had blown the alarm, people would have gone toward the fire. So it just brings up the question is, how do you approach multiple possible disasters with icons?
I don't know if Rodrigo might want to say something about that. Because he's also in the call and he's the icon man when it comes to disasters. But I think in short, I think multi-hazard scenarios are as far as we're concerned sort of the next frontier, because a lot of the work that's been done so far is really focusing on a single type of hazard. Maybe Claudine, you want to say something about what you've done with tsunami and fire clear?
Yeah, I sided with the EM on that. Saskia and I just met yesterday talking about semiotics and sound. And what's not accounted for is the cognitive stresses that happen in a hazard. And so by sounding the alarm, who's to say that they would have ran in the, like, it's almost putting too much assumption of high-level decision-making on people who are under distress. We talked about this during COVID. During COVID, when there was a fire here, and but their shelters were only limited on who they could take because of the COVID. Having a reduced number of physical distance, and so they were not prepared for that, and so a lot of people got turned away. And so we were talking with this group, DNM group, was talking about multi-hazards and dealing and coping with that. My stuff is interesting because it's still isolating. The infrastructure looks the same, but tsunami is for tsunami, wildfire is wildfire. They haven't joined, and I'm actually in the middle of a project right now where we're actually looking at what if they start to join. And I don't know if, again, staying with just icons or just alarms, or this is going to be a reevaluation of those traditional deliverables. Re-looking at the what ifs. That's why I thought the dynamic science was really interesting, right? And using it in that context, it might be a completely different systems thinking about design in those multi-hazard scenarios.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we're thinking now very much on the preventative end, because we know that there's a lot to be gained on that space. But in the end, what you have to think about is that a user, a person, goes through an entire journey from either getting prepared or not, them being confronted with whatever they're being confronted with, whether that's a tsunami or a fire. And then then you have to guide them to safety. And that second part is often forgotten. What I do find very interesting also, for example, is that Japan has actually made it mandatory that they have a whole system of signage when it comes to hazards. And so where they might have a tsunami warning sign at a beach, they then also, just like Claudine has done for various counties in Southern California, they have signs that'll guide you to the nearest shelter. But then actually when you get to the shelter, there'll be specific signs on there again to show you whether the shelter is appropriate for the hazard that you're facing. And I think that that's sort of, as far as that sort of work has gotten, unless, I don't know if Rodrigo wants to say anything about icons for different types of emergencies.
Karen raised her hand as well. Oh, sorry, Rodrigo, do you want to add something?
No, I agree completely with Claudine's and Saskia's idea. Just to add a word, the icons maybe are part of they integrate a support system. It's the same with words, with labelings, with colors. Media supports different, and as Claudine said, is different from scenario to scenario, are completely different. So this is part of also of your question.
Karen.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wondered, Saskia, about what you had mentioned regarding that one slide you put up with the map versus the infographic. And you had said that you thought that the people had responded well to the map, but did better with the infographic. And I'm wondering about that kind of performance preference trade-off and where you come down on it from a design point of view. Would you say that what would be the next step? Is some combination, or is it to go with the map? Or what would you conclude from what you saw? Thank you.
So this is actually Josefina Bravo's work. So I'm not going to speak for her in terms of what she would do next. But what I think is really important is that we keep on all sorts of levels and for all sorts of hazards, we sort of keep searching for this silver bullet, the one thing that's going to give everybody the right information. And I think we really have to step away from that. For one thing, accessibility becomes an issue. And so you have to make the same information available in many different ways and in many different formats so that people can find something that they can work with. And I think that's really what we need to start looking for rather than a one size fits all, because there is no one size fits all. I hope that answers your question.
I just want to
Yes,
say too,
thank you.
I work a lot with maps, and I think that, but believe you me, people do not anchor to those GIS scientific maps. Everyday people need to find a relationship. It is a relationship, the anchor or not. So even accuracy is not part of the priority there. So for emergency managers, their outcomes accuracy. They always ask me, where's my GIS? And I say, the first thing I say is all my maps lie. And they're like, just to be dramatic. And, I'm using diagrams. And because I'm interested in that relationship, because if there's no motivation to interact or to see themselves in the information, it's not going to be retained. It's not going to function. And so I think, and again, this is Josefina's work, and her chapter is really amazing as far as getting into all the details of the study. But from my work, it is about a sense of place. It is about a sense of understanding where they are and that they could actually see themselves, their kids' school, their work, the freeways they take in this infrastructure. And so it's really about that balance. And I just echoing, I'm huge on the alternative formats, and really we have barely started to chip away at what that means. Emergency managers are not thinking about it as much, actually, from my experience, almost at all. And I get shocked by it, except for San Francisco. They're like, except that once, where they actually have it part of their regulations to have alternative formats. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a little bit of my perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, Thomas, question from Thomas.
Yes, please. I would like to know if your work on natural disasters has led you to any reflections on how warnings should be presented in technical documentation, which tries to warn the user of various disasters such as electrocution or explosion, and traditionally uses red and yellow boxes, which are sometimes stacked up and in one part of at the beginning of each chapter, which might cover the manufacturer's legal responsibility, but the user might not necessarily read them all carefully when they're learning how to use the system. Do you have any suggestions on a more effective way of presenting warnings in technical documentation?
Interesting question, and I can't say that I've actually thought about that. But I think there could be some interesting crossover that we can learn. And I think that the thing that really immediately comes to mind is what Claudine was just saying. You need to make it relevant for people. They need to have a relationship with that information. I mean, just taking my very own experience, what I have to do when I get something new is, oh, great, now let's toss the manual aside and I'll first look at the device. Yeah. And I think just getting a better handle on what are the steps that somebody takes, what are they interested in, at which point can you insert that warning, and where do you insert that warning, and in which way. I think there's some interesting thinking that has probably been done in that space, but I don't know any of it.
I know there was a book that just came out, and I'm flaking on the name, but there's been a good study on that, warnings in documentation. And what's interesting about that, this is really great because you're looking at the micro individual technical portion, and what we're looking at is this grandiose mass, right, communication to masses. But I remember, and I don't know if Jillian's here, but we had Paul Stiff for our Reading University, we went to get our master's in Reading, and one of our projects was, how do you show instructions of jump starting a car in the rain, right? With these cables. And so we were having that discussion about how do you clearly warn somebody about the dangers and not only just as a whole, but in situation. So we're really interested, the in situation being in the rain, because we get our jump cables from an auto store, we put it in our trunk and everything's great until you have to use them. The in situation part is what I really became interested in. It's dark, side of the road, 2 a.m. in the rain. Now what? Now how does that instructions translate in situation? And I think that crossover is super fantastic and interesting from the micro level to the macro. But Carol, do you there's a book that just came out because of all your books in the background.
It's not
Do you
here
know who
yet.
I'm talking about? Do you know who I'm talking about? The warnings.
I've got to check that. I will put it on the somewhere. I hate to give the wrong information, so I'll check it first.
Karen, you raised your hand as well.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment about Thomas's question. In my experience, I've dealt with designing many technical documents, and there's two problems with the warnings. One is that the companies feel obliged to front load the warnings all in one place, usually in the front cover or on the left side and the right side. And as soon as you open the TOC, boom, you get hit with some more. My experience is that companies tend to think of each warning as a separate object almost, and that they never really think about an integrated perspective. So for example, one time we were working on a manual for a telephone answering machine, and the company knew that the answering machine would create interference if the user put it near various things like a microwave or a TV, or if there was a car going by outside. So in the manual, they had tiny little icons, some cartoons, some icons, some naturalistic pictures, just the whole gamut of sort of a hodgepodge of different design strategies, but they would be kind of assembled on one page and then they would get bigger on another page, and it was kind of a nightmare. And so what we did was to, much like the map, create a room that had all of these objects in it that could create interference, and then show them with icons what was going on in different positions. We found that people could understand this more holistic perspective right away, whereas the other way, they had to kind of put the whole thing together for themselves. So my recommendation is to give on-the-spot warnings, not have them have to remember all this stuff and then read about it and then, oh yeah, I was supposed to do that. They just don't remember.
Thank
And I
you.
think another interesting thing when it comes to icons and icon usage is that, you know, we know that the Gamil icons are tested to a very high level of understanding. And once they reach, you know, once a version of the icon reaches a good level of understanding, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Rodrigo, but it's 80%. And people understand what's being communicated there. I think a lot of these technical icons, you know, one of the jokes that I've got going with Klaus Kramer, who's part of our group, but he's in New Zealand and he's not here right now, is, but we send each other funny icons that can be interpreted totally incorrectly. And we're like, well, what do you think this one means? What do you think this one means? There's just a whole host of them. We could probably fill a book with them. That would be quite a good book. But yeah, try and test the icons would be my other suggestion.
Thank you.
I think we got I think we got a very good idea about a new book here. Incomprehensible icons and how people misinterpret them in the tests. It's going to be fantastic. We talk about 20% that's not understood. The 80% of people can understand it, but are looking for the reactions of people who can't understand it. Veronica?
Eloisa, you raised your hand.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the great conversation. In your presentation, there was one slide with the topics covered in the book, and there was language. And I'm curious to know if there is a chapter on language or if language is kind of in the background of all discussions. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So I saw Amy here. Hi, Amy. Amy Takabi. She she did the study on language. It is not, in my mind's eye, not supplemental. Not since I came out of grad school. It has never been a supplement. It's like I understood. And I fight this a lot. So in my experience, language, and it's written about, it's threaded actually through chapters. It's threaded, but I love Amy's chapter because it concentrates on the use of language in her study. And I don't know, Amy, if you feel comfortable, she's one of our contributors speaking, but it is threaded through as part of the critical deliverable of giving the information. So I'm trying to move away from just visual communication, right? It's communication in all sense, whether it's auditory, tactile, all different ways that we get information, and the density of it, because emergency managers also do not understand their language choices. It's big word, like mitigation. I have a problem every time I say that word, fire mitigation. So it's definitely threaded through, and we did dedicate, it's the last bookend chapter of our book about just language and just focusing on that, social media. So Amy was doing a lot of the analysis on how the word terminology from social media to broadcasting and how language is used there.
That's great. I'll connect with Amy right now in the chat.
Yeah, she mentioned something there for us too. She did a better job than I did. So Amy's like, this is.
And I think language is a really interesting point. There's actually 2 points that came to mind when we started talking about language. One is that if you're looking at really the language of warnings, there's a US researcher, her name escapes me right now, but her blog is thewarnroom.com. And she actually takes these warnings from emergency management and rewrites them, because she's established through her research that if you're issuing a warning, there's a couple of key pieces of information that need to be in there. And ideally you put them in the right sequence as well. So that's just about warnings. And actually that, for some reason, my mind then leapt to, but why do emergency managers struggle to engage with designers? And actually zooming out a little bit there about why does emergency management struggle to engage the public more broadly? And that's quite simply because it's not at the top of mind. And where we're, if you're going around the grocery store, unless you've been prompted by something in that grocery store to stock up on your water or your canned vegetables or whatever that you need in your emergency kit, you're not going to do it. You're not going to think about that. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in these sorts of spaces that we can think about. And I think the example that I came across recently that I thought was really good is, again, I was in the grocery store, and at the bit where you get your cart or you get your basket, the food bank gave me a little list. And they're like, hi, this is what we need right now in our food drive. And because I was then going around the grocery store with this list, I'm like, okay, fine, I'll add some muesli bars into my basket. But I think, you could do a similar approach for emergency supplies. But I think this is just not something that would come to mind to emergency managers, because obviously when you're working with this material day in, day out, it's really important to you. And of course you're going to be prepared, but it's really hard sometimes to then step into somebody else's shoes and see the world from their perspective. And actually, to them, they don't care about emergency preparedness because they're struggling just to make their money last to the end of the week, to get their kids fed, to get their kids to clothes, and to get their kids to school and back. And then, emergency preparedness is going to be something that's way out of line with their sort of experience.
We have a question in the blog, in the chat, from Patricia Tiffany. She says, do you have any good examples of design in tools emergency managers use on a regular basis, like weekly or monthly basis? How do emergency managers work? Is that correct, Tiffany? You're still here, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a real, I think I'm having this back. What FEMA approached me once FEMA is our huge federal emergency management agency in the United States. And they gave me a design, sorry, is it the shelter in place disaster tree? And I realized their resources was Word by on their own. Like they just had, it's not even the tools. They're not even aware. And this is, and I think that this is FEMA. Like this is our largest, funded agency responsible for communication. And I think, Saskia, you mentioned Canva. I'm hoping I'm getting this question right. I'm thinking you're thinking, and then they hire graphic designers. There's we know a few graphic designers who work for EMs, but taking traditional advertising PR approaches and not the functional, information design approaches. Do I have your question right? Is that what you were asking?
I can just clarify quickly. I was thinking of like emergency managers, I guess, have to understand risk and like where the risk is, where the hazards are, and things like that. And like it's hard to design a tool that people will use regularly. So I'm wondering, like in that sense, do you know of any good examples of like things that like people use to understand emergency, like hazards and risk regularly?
Yeah, so they use Esri. So they're using GIS interactive, like, so I'll speak for the things I've worked for. So tsunami, inundation, again, flooding, the zones, and fire risk here in California. And they send out these links to the public, and it's just an Esri interactive. You put your address in, and it spits out the information of risk. They also use the same infrastructure during evacuation. But I will tell you, these are these dense scientific GIS maps. So they're just regurgitating the scientific dense data maps and just just passing it through to the public. That is the standard here for the most parts in the States. There might be a little, there's much more of a effort to understand that actually no one's going to understand this. This is actually really intimidating. And in some cases was wrong because those tools are so accurate that it won't include different counties. So it'll just be like, this is for Irvine. And then Irvine is actually, Tustin is another city nestled in Irvine, but it won't give the information in that area. So that's kind of how I've seen tools used and what I've been working with, but I don't know if I'm talking locally specifically, if anyone else.
I think that's what so I was just in New Zealand for a month late last year, and you saw the same. So what emergency managers do is they rely very heavily on GIS data and just either the free or the paid suite by Esri. The free suite is QGIS, and they'll work with scientists in scientific models. And so these are the tools that they're comfortable working with, or at least the data that flows from them, they're comfortable interpreting that. I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
My favorite is when they just like use that map and then they place like, here's the shelter. Then they use it and then they're like, and here's where, they try to humanize it and to make it relevant. But yeah, so, and I think there's a chapter here on the hurricane interface that NOAA uses. So again, it's the same, we see patterns, and I find it interesting when
I'm
we see
going to just
patterns.
quickly share this. I don't know if you can see it.
Perfect.
Cool. And so this is actually on the left there, we have the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand, which is their tsunami viewer. So it's looking at this inundation, where you're going to flood to. On the right there, I actually have the Dutch website that you can put your postcode in and see where you're going to flood. And I think what's really interesting about this is that the Dutch one, you put in your postcode. It's really clear to me, obviously understanding Dutch, but it says location, put your address or postcode in. I go to the Bay of Plenty viewer, and I know that, from my background, I know, okay, I have to go to the little magnifying glass, and there I can put in my address and then look at what's going to happen. And so, because I don't have an address in the Bay of Plenty, I picked an ice cream parlor. But I put in my parents' address in the other one. And you can see the difference here. Okay, so the ice cream parlor is going to flood. We can see that in the left there. Doesn't tell me how bad. Maybe not so bad because it's near the edge, but I'm just guessing here. No idea how high the water's going to come. On the right, we actually see that my parents' house will flood to a maximum of 3 meters. And there's a very basic sort of graphic there showing, okay, well, you'll be up in the attic then. And it also says, what does it mean for me? It means I don't have water. It means I don't have a functioning toilet. It means I have no electricity, no internet, and no gas. And then actually, the Dutch one on the right says you can start to prepare by clicking on the orange button. Oh, I don't have more of this. But then it takes you actually, if you click on the orange button, they will take you through like, what can you do to prepare? On the left, very traditional emergency management type approach to how do you prepare for flooding or for tsunami in this case. And there's nothing that's helping me there to say what are the steps that I need to take. And I think these are, these are small steps that we can take to actually get quite big gains and huge wins in that space.
One last question. Who wants?
No,
Nope.
no more questions in the chats.
Can I just say one more thing? I just want to go back to Halosa's question on language. And then Carol, you put something really interesting on the chat about the cell phone and warnings through text. And the study that I did was the text. So text is a visual activity, right? Typography, even if you get it on their phone, that has been the most successful in immediate recall. So remembering information right away is getting text and words. And I think more, as Amy was also contributing, more emphasis on the language, but also how it's presented. I know in the States they're doing, like, they call it pods. They do the same thing, Carol, like where they're sending out using cell phone, because just like we're all saying, it's right on mostly on a person that they get that access. They don't have to go to the icon or see signage. So I just wanted to kind of, I guess, catch all this by going back to that really, just like in plain language and all the studies that have been going here, but in this space of emergency information, I think that's going to really take off.
Wonderful. I'm really sure that we could spend quite a few more hours discussing this. We promised that we would stop at the hour exactly. So I would really like to thank Saskia and Claudine for this absolutely brilliant discussion and the presentation they gave, and opening this topic through the book and through presentations. And it takes years to get to this level, and it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next conversation is on IEEE conversation number 17. Will be on February the 8th, on the Thursday, about the same time. And Robert Linsky, who's here today as well, will talk about the way communication should be. And I really look forward to that one as well. So thank you very, very much. And I hope to see you at the next conversation in a few weeks' time. Thank you.